I think Democrats will pull it off. By the time we get to November 3rd, I think they will outperform and end up controlling the Senate to the surprise of the pundits. His approval ratings are so bad right now, and he can't really get success on Hormuz and lowering oil prices dramatically. So he's just trying to fire up his base with nationalism so that they turn out for the election, because what he's worried about is Republicans are not even going to turn out.
I'm pleased to welcome back to the show Matt Gertken, Chief Geopolitical Strategist at BCA Research and the author of his new book, Swift's Grand Strategy, From Foreign Policy to International Thought. We'll be going over how this theme from the book ties into current events. How did Britain maintain supremacy in the 17th and 18th centuries? And what lessons can America learn today? What is likely going to be Trump's grand strategy with foreign policy in the Middle East and domestic policy? How can the Americans fight inflation? And what can we expect, importantly, from the midterm elections? Right now, on prediction markets, Cauchy in particular, there is an 86% chance that the Democrats will win the House at the upcoming midterm election, and a 52% chance that the Republicans will win the Senate. So 50-50 on the Senate, overwhelmingly in favor of the Democrats for the House. So we'll find out what Matt Gertken thinks. If you believe that the Republicans can win the Senate and you place a $50 trade on Cauchy, your payout could be $91 if you're correct, and the Republicans do take the Senate by November. This video is brought to you by Cauchy. It's the largest prediction market in the United States. Unlike a sports book, you're trading peer-to-peer on real-world events, from economic data to political outcomes, and the price moves based on public opinion, not a house. Go to the link in the description down below or scan the QR code here to get started. New users who use my code LIN, L-I-N, can get $25 if you trade $25. Cauchy is CFTC approved and available in all 50 states, including California and Texas. Matt, welcome back. Good to see you.
You too, David. Thanks for having me back.
Let's just start with the midterm preview. So, trading predictions on prediction markets. Which party will win the House? Let's go over the House first and then the Senate. Right now, traders are predicting the Democrats, 86% and 14% Republicans. Let's go over this. What's your thought process here?
I mean, the House is a foregone conclusion. There's the midterm curse. It almost always is an anti-incumbent election. Republicans only have a 2-seat majority. Democrats are leading by 5 percentage points in the generic polling, and the president has a net negative 16% approval rating. Only 33% of the country thinks that the country is on the right track, and Congress's approval rating is 20% or 25%. That's 10 points down from when the One Big Beautiful Bill was passed. So basically, we're obviously going to see the House turn. Probably 20 or 40 seats will shift in favor of the Democrats. And then from that position, they can control the purse. That's the power of the purse, and it's pretty significant. But of course, there are conditions where things could even get worse for Republicans. Either way, Democrats will have a majority in the House.
Okay, Senate, and right now it's looking pretty even, actually. 52
Senate,
Republicans, 48 Democrats, yeah.
Yeah, the Senate odds are 50-50 if you look there. I mean, I would go, and I have been saying all year that this is going to go in favor of Democrats. It's a very tough hill for them to climb, so no one should take it for granted. And that just has to do with the rotation of seats. In 2020, Democrats had a really great year. So that means they're having to defend a lot of seats. And some of them are pretty squishy. So, for example, in Maine, they had to replace their candidate, who was scandalous. And Susan Collins is a moderate Republican who's been elected 4 times. So I think they will win Maine, but it is a battle. Michigan, they have elected someone who's Abdul Said is a Muslim, and he's also very left-wing. He doesn't claim to be a democratic socialist, but he is a populist left-winger and an outsider, although he has a great set of credentials. So he's a very competitive candidate. And there again, I think he can win that Senate seat, but it'll be a very tough battle in Michigan. In addition to winning those, they also have to turn some very red states like Alaska. Ohio has been red recently. They are leading in the polls there, but they have to win that seat. And then they need somewhere like even Iowa or Texas. It's going to be tough. So anyway, when we look at the trends, particularly those statistics I mentioned earlier, how unhappy Americans are with with inflation, with the incumbent government, with inequality, I think Democrats will pull it off. Well, right now, they probably are going to get about 50 seats, which means that the vice president would break a tie and Republicans would retain control. But by the time we get to November 3rd, I think they will outperform and end up controlling the Senate to the surprise of the pundits.
Interesting. If you look here at this chart, the odds of a Republican Senate have been dwindling ever since actually the beginning of or mid-January before the Iran war. And that closed off to basically 50-50 following the bombing of Iran on the 28th of February. Anyway, the point is, what contributed to actually the declining favorability of the Republicans even in early February?
It was inflation and affordability. So the one big beautiful bill passed and the tariffs passed. So 2025 was, as is typical, the first year of a presidency, getting a lot of things done. But did those things address the fundamental reason why the Biden administration was kicked out of office and Trump and Republicans were brought back in? That was inflation. Well, what we saw is that tariffs actually did add to inflation, at least half a percentage point or a whole percentage point to goods inflation. And we also saw that the economy remained very robust, which is a good thing. But then, of course, prices remain robust. And then finally, the president then ended up with the Iran war and oil prices went up. And, fuel prices, gasoline prices at the pump have a huge impact on the psychology of voters. Inflation was not a problem when President Obama was in power, but oil prices were high and the midterm elections punished him severely. And so, you could see that not only did voters start to become disenchanted with President Trump after he passed his big bill and the tax cuts didn't really do anything for the average voter, inflation remained high, but then you got the fuel price impact, and that's why I think Democrats will outperform in the Senate.
Look, hindsight's 2020, but I think it doesn't take a super genius to figure that out. If you bomb Iran, oil prices will probably shoot up, at least in the short term.
Yeah.
There are a lot of smart people working for the Trump administration. Why did they bomb Iran right before the midterms?
Great question. They knew it would happen. Look, this is a great example of politics versus geopolitics. From a political perspective, President Trump never should have engaged in the war. So either it was a mistake or he had and his team had hubris. They just thought they could do everything at once, manage the consequences effectively. I would argue that it was geopolitical. Simply, the U.S. and Israel have long had a red line against Iranian nuclear weaponization. Iran had built up a large stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which has no purpose for, you don't need highly enriched uranium to build civilian electricity capacity. So basically, when the unrest and the riots started in Iran, Israel and the U.S. decided there was a critical vulnerability in the regime. They had the best opportunity they were ever going to have to stop the nuclear program and change the regime's behavior, and they went for it. And that was essentially a geopolitical decision, and it did fly in the face of the president's midterm election odds. And it shows that the president in a second-term presidency, remember, he has a different agenda as an individual leading American foreign policy than the Republican Party does, where they have to worry about midterm elections.
You've said before that the losing formula for the Republicans is higher inflation and higher unemployment. So we've got the higher inflation front. The labor market has been weakening somewhat. The unemployment rate hasn't really spiked dramatically. Do you give any edge to the Republicans at all at this point?
Well, that would be a great case for saying that they may retain the Senate, which is not my view, but of course I'm forecasting. When we look at the data right at our fingertips right today, it does imply Republicans could retain the Senate. And that's why the betting markets are 50-50. And one reason for that is the resilience of the economy, huge investment in data centers and AI, productivity is growing pretty well, unemployment is low, the job market is pretty well balanced. So basically, even though there is let's be clear, real incomes are shrinking. So it's not like real incomes, when you adjust for inflation, it's not like incomes are actually beneficial here, but people still have jobs. So, this is an environment where you have to give credit to the administration, well, and particularly credit to the American economy for generating technological innovation and productivity. But let's just also acknowledge two things. One, that unemployment rate is so low that it probably won't go much lower. So if we're thinking about 2028 and beyond, you're probably going to have unemployment coming up, and you're also going to have this sticky inflation. But the other thing is, as things stand today, inflation has come down from the Biden era. Unemployment is low. What's the problem? Well, that points to inequality. What that shows is that the structural inequality in the US economy is such that even when unemployment is low and inflation is being tamed, Americans are still ticked off and they vote against the incumbent party. And the only way to really explain that is because of the persistent inequality, and the tax cuts probably fed into that.
I'm curious as to what further intervention measures would be enacted before the midterms. I'm talking about from both the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, and perhaps even from Congress. Let's talk about what the Treasury has done so far. Intervention in the yen market July 31st, and then last week announced that they would double bond buybacks from $2 to $4 billion per operation, and then Besson said he could go above $4 billion, and then he said, well, we could use the entirety of the Treasury general account of up to $1 trillion if needed. That's opened up to us.
Yeah, so let's think about this all in a big picture way. The Congress, remember I mentioned Republicans only had effectively, they had like a 2-seat majority this year, a very paper thin majority. In other words, Congress is already paralyzed. You couldn't pass anything during a midterm election year when you had already done a one big beautiful bill, a big budget blowout. And the only thing they were able to pass was a reconciliation bill to give funding for border security and homeland security. So they got that done, but it was nothing, right? That didn't change American perceptions on the whole. Now, what that means is that the president pivoted to foreign policy. Venezuela, Iran, basically, I can't get anything done at home. I'm going to go abroad. That's what the president did. Now, Congress not getting a fiscal package done. What does that do? Well, you also have the Supreme Court shoot down tariffs, so you're not getting the revenue. So what it means is that the deficit bulges, you're not getting tariff revenue. Deficit bulges, economy's resilient, bond market starts to worry, yields start to rise, but you can't do a fiscal package because Congress is tied down. So you need the Treasury to intervene. Now, the president, obviously, and many administrations, both political parties, anybody is going to use the tools they have as the executive branch to try to smooth things over for the midterm election. But the thing is that a $4 billion intervention here is not really enough to pacify a $30 trillion debt Treasury market, So in other words, what the fiscal solution that Congress would need to provide is not there, and bond markets will continue to be agitated. The Treasury is saying we will intervene, but the intervention could backfire. It could be insufficient, and it'll just be a tug of war. The whole point, though, is that the Treasury Secretary isn't going to sit there on his hands. He's going to try to do some things to at least deter and jawbone the market, and maybe even more than jawbone, just to try to prevent yields from blowing up ahead of the election and causing financial instability.
Do you think markets would react significantly to both outcomes here? We've got the Democrats in option A, the Democrats taking both the House and the Senate, or option B, the Democrats only take the House.
Okay, one point of fact is that historically, now there's not a lot of cases, right? But in modern history, if the opposition party wins both houses, then over the next 12 months, the real total return on the stock market is actually better than if they only take one house. So that's interesting. So in other words, if you thought that, oh no, the Democrats are socialists, if they win all of Congress, it's going to be negative for the market. That isn't what history shows. History shows that it's better to have the opposition control all of, the House and the Senate, so that they can pass legislation, so that they can force the president, and you get bipartisan legislation, and you get the wheels moving in a way that is bipartisan, so it's not hostile to markets. That's better than just having a divided Congress where everything is paralyzed. You can't pass anything. The House might end up obstructing the fiscal mechanism, and then you get government shutdowns, you get debt ceiling debacles, or you might simply just have continuing resolutions that keep federal spending flat. None of those things are terrible, but they just have in the past created more uncertainty and perhaps less returns, although those returns are still positive even when you have a divided Congress.
That's interesting. Which of those scenarios actually provides more uncertainty? I would have thought that if the opposition controls both the House and the Senate, there would be more uncertainty in the markets, because at least we know if Republicans control both, we know what to expect we can expect more tariffs. We can expect perhaps a stalling in the Iran war. Like Trump's playbook, we can probably predict at this point. But if the Democrats come in, then what does he do is the question.
Yeah, right. So again, historically, it's better if the opposition wins both houses. But that's just history, right? Things could change. So your question is valid. So what I would say is this. if Democrats win all of Congress, the legislature, now it's incumbent on them to do something, to pass positive laws that persuade voters that they're better at governing. And and they need to get those laws enacted, right? Trump could just veto them if they're, hostile. So if Democrats come in and try to sabotage Trump's government by massively raising taxes, for example, or massively increasing spending and jacking up inflation, Trump will just veto it. But then they look like idiots. So if they control all of Congress, they have to craft a bill that he is forced to sign because it's so popular. Maybe modest tax increases on the wealthy, or maybe modest AI regulation, or maybe some spending cuts to defense. Let's cut back on the Iran war. And maybe Trump is forced to agree to that simply because the war is unpopular and he doesn't want to have that albatross around his neck. So the point is, a full Congress of Democrats has to govern, and they need the president ultimately to agree so that they look like they're the responsible governors of the country and can build themselves up for 2028. And now the market won't think that's hostile, because even though it does involve passing legislation, it will by definition be bipartisan legislation. The president won't sign it if it's hostile to the markets or the economy.
And 3 months before the midterm elections, President Trump has decided that he would enact 50% tariffs on select number of Canadian imports of up to $20 billion. And just yesterday, on Tuesday, the Canadians retaliated with dollar-for-dollar tariffs of their own. And the full list includes seafood and furniture and even hockey sticks. It's quite an extensive list. And the president had to invoke an old section of the Tariff Act of 1930, apparently Section 338, which allows countries, to the United States in particular, to enact tariffs of up to 50% against countries whose trade practices are deemed unfair or predatory. And J.D. Vance actually said this on air in a TV interview. He said that Canada has been very unfair in their trade negotiations, and they've dropped a lot of deals. Anyway, the point remains that both sides have seemed to escalate the trade war for now. Is this just bluster from both sides before we see de-escalation again? Is Trump gonna taco?
Probably bluster and de-escalation. And the reason is, well, first of all, let's bear in mind about 4/5 of the trade between these two giant, trading partners is not suffering tariffs because it's under the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, the trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated. Since he negotiated it, he doesn't really want to get rid of it. He's willing to renew it every year. And so most goods are not under tariff. Now you've got this remaining 15 or 20% of goods that can be tariffed. Now President Trump targets some of those. But of course, he doesn't want to touch critical minerals or fuel. Oil is one of the biggest imports from Canada. He doesn't want to dabble with that. So he's just targeting this remaining stuff. And he's doing it because it's small enough that he doesn't think it's going to have a big impact on the election. But get this, his approval ratings are so bad right now, and he can't really get success on Hormuz and lowering oil prices dramatically. So he's just trying to fire up his base with nationalism so that they turn out for the election, because what he's worried about is Republicans are not even going to turn out because they're disenchanted. And he knows Democrats are going to turn out, and he knows that independents are going the opposite direction. So how can he fire up his base? Well, pick a fight with the neighbor, rally around the flag, and highlight the trade issue, the protectionism issue, which has motivated his base in the past. But that also means that you're talking about not implementing those auto tariffs, which notice that he put those on January 1st after the midterm, and he probably won't actually do them. So this is about the midterm election, firing up the base. And then on the Canadian side, well, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, is in a great position to fight this battle because it unites all of Canadians. And he's in a situation where, at least ostensibly, Alberta and Canada are flirting with, Alberta and Quebec are flirting with secessionism again. And obviously, they're not really going to do that. But one way to ensure that that there isn't any momentum for secession is to rally around the flag and do battle with the evil Donald Trump. So, because he's attacking the Canadian economy, and he's even threatened Canadian sovereignty.
This is why you and your colleague Marco Poppich wrote a piece called "Oh America, Why Trade War is Good for Canada." Is that what you mean?
Yeah, because what it does is it unites the population under the current government, and then they can further integrate the economy through measures that force the provinces to expand infrastructure and, well, enable the provinces to expand infrastructure and trade ties with each other and with foreign countries as well. Now, one critical disagreement here, which Vance and others in the Trump administration are referring to, is that the U.S. wants Canada to cooperate when it comes to trading with China. They do not want Canada to be a backdoor for China trade. And that's probably, in the end, going to be something that the U.S. and Canada can agree on because it's fundamental to U.S. national security that there needs to be a reduction in the dependency on China. And the U.S. and Canada have such a deep economic and security relationship that they'll probably be able to negotiate that. But on the surface, if the Americans say, well, we want a veto power over your trade deals with third parties, Canada has to say no. They have to defend their own interests and their own ability to freely trade with the rest of the world. So the China element, will be dealt with later. But right now, what you can see is that Canada has to defend its sovereignty.
Just on that point, do you think that these current events, specifically trade wars, will affect the Liberal standing with Canadians in any significant way? I've seen comments on the internet from both sides. One, yes, we support Carney and standing up for Canadians. And on the other hand, we'd rather trust the Americans than the Chinese when it comes to trade. So,
right, because China has in fact failed to reform their economy, and they are overproducing goods and generating global imbalances that do ultimately deindustrialize Canada as well as the United States. So that's fair. And what American critics of President Trump would say is that instead of unifying the democratic world and the developed markets against China's overproduction, President Trump is distracting and causing divisions within the democratic group by waging trade war against democracy. So that's a whole element of U.S. strategy, and it shows that there's an incoherence in U.S. strategy right now, and it's probably because China's rise strategically is challenging the U.S., and the U.S. hasn't figured out yet what to do about it. And so we're seeing vacillations across different administrations. But the point to what you're saying is Canadians have to deal with the United States. I mean, a fifth of the economy is exports to the United States.
Right.
So Carney has to harness this nationalism for now, but then he has to be smart about it so that we don't actually end up with huge tariffs on auto parts coming from Canada. Because if that's the end game, it's going to hurt the Canadian economy, and Carney and his party will suffer. So in fact, what he has to do, he has to play it tough, but then he in the end, he needs a deal.
How does that even make sense? Like, I was having this discussion with a friend the other day. Canadian auto tariffs. First of all, Canada doesn't have its own car companies. They produce American cars for American car companies. They're Canadian subsidiaries. So if you tariff Canadian auto parts, are you just tariffing yourself? I'm confused. I don't know how that works. Yeah.
Well, you're right. I mean, we have an international supply chain that's highly diverse and distributed across countries, and so these tariffs do hit Detroit, and and they backfire, and then President Trump ends up having to water them down, and that's what we see. Yeah. But again, we can't just ignore the fact that the U.S. and other countries, including Europe, in the face of China, for example, they do need to have some oversight and control over their supply chain so that they don't wipe out their manufacturing and become overdependent on critical parts from China. And that's the end game here. But as we can see, the Trump administration is pursuing a sort of a hatchet approach rather than a scalpel approach. And they're losing political capital for doing this. The American public is not supportive of trade war with Canada. So in the end, the Trump administration will have to be brought to heel on this particular issue.
You wrote a book about Jonathan Swift. It's called Swift's Grand Strategy from Foreign Policy to International Thought. It just came out. Congrats on the book launch. Let's tie this to current events. Swift was not only one of the great satirists of English literature, but he also became an influential political writer. People might know him as the author of Gulliver's Travels and The Modest Proposal, but we can kind of look at what he's done here and tie this into current events. What have you learned about Swift's writing and studying his work, and how can you relate foreign policy from 19th century Britain, the world's greatest power back then, to what America is doing now, the greatest power arguably in contemporary times?
Yeah, thank you, David, for signing the book, and I hope everyone will go out and read it. Look, the key thing here is that 18th century the modern world, right? And the debates, the cultural debate, the culture wars that they were having were amazingly similar to ours. So, for example, they're having technological revolution spreading information, and it's creating a challenge to authority. Where does authority come from? Who regulates? Who gets to say what? And then that generates real debate about fundamental values. Huge partisanship is reinforced by the fact that people can sort of say whatever they want. And as this is happening, you have this huge power emerging abroad. In this case, it was France in the 18th century, but today it's China, right? And they're challenging the world system. Now, you organize a grand alliance around those, but the problem is what happened if your deficits get too big? So what Britain ended up doing was negotiating with France and quote unquote betraying the allies so that it could reform its spending practices and manage its budget deficits. But the Allies, of course, viewed it as betraying them. And this is very similar to the nationalist emergence that we saw with President Trump trying to do deficits and negotiating with China, putting a 7% tariff on China when he's threatening a much larger tariff on Canada. And so the question is, how does all this play out going forward? Well, the key is this. First of all, countries do face economic and fiscal constraints. That's important, and it will ultimately impact their foreign policy. It'll also impact their domestic policy. But I think more particularly, we will ultimately see the United States maintain its alliances, which is what Britain ended up doing. But it does have to be able to work with China and coexist with China. And that's an economic reality, but it's also a strategic reality because endless war is not actually a solution. And that's the takeaway if we try to apply this 18th century modern culture war about grand strategy to the current conditions today.
So I'll finish off with this final question. Trump has 2 more years, regardless of what happens with the midterm elections. He's got 2 more years in office. If he had to write a book later about Trump's grand strategy, if you were to call the book that, and you had to write the final chapters of his final 2 years in office, what would that look like in regards to Iran, trade wars, and everything else?
Well, it's absolutely critical. What Jonathan Swift and his peers were doing is they were saying that Britain ultimately needs to keep the allies on board, even though they need to negotiate with the enemy, France. That means, in today's terms, President Trump must maintain the Democratic alliance, the NATO alliance, U.S. alliances around the world. If he pursues a line that fundamentally damages the psychology of U.S. alliances, especially NATO, given the Russia challenge and Russian sabotage in Europe, if he does that, then he will be deemed a major failure in American history and American presidential rankings. But if he swings behind the allies in the end and ultimately accepts the fact that the U.S. is embedded in this international economy and democratic alliances, and then concentrates his animus on getting a better deal out of China so that rebalancing can happen in the world system, I mean, that would be extraordinary. Now, I think viewers are going to think, well, that's wishful thinking. Probably so. But the key is, will the president maintain U.S. alliances while he pushes for change? Notice that NATO defense spending, last point, NATO defense spending has gone up. So U.S. allies are picking up the slack. They are stopping the free ride by committing more to the defense alliance. President Trump needs to take yes for an answer, and then cooperate more on trade with allies. And in the end, he would be deemed a more successful president.
Just one final point on this. There's a lot of rhetoric about how Trump has been alienating his allies. And on paper and on the headlines you see in the media, certainly that may be the case, escalating trade war with Canada, for example. But behind the scenes, is there actual any damage done to the alliance? Because I've heard that behind the scenes, they're all friends.
Well, behind the scenes, the elites always have to hobnob with each other, right? And, until things get real bad. But look, no, there is real damage done to the hearts and minds of allies when the U.S. insults their sovereignty. And so the only saving grace is that the U.S. has term limits on its presidents. Now, those who are very worried about Trump think that he's going to stay beyond his term, but institutionally, structurally, he doesn't have the power to do that. So he's out on January 20th, 2029, and the United States can then start to rebuild its relationships. But some damage has been done, and it's permanent. And in the case of Canada in particular, I think the insult to sovereignty has been significant enough that it won't be forgotten for a long time. There will be some heartburn, but we won't have American presidents endlessly pursuing this Trump agenda. And the reason why is because it's in the U.S. interest to remain in the largest economic and security alliance in the world, which is what the democracies have. So I think what we'll see is that Trump was probably an aberration. Maybe you could call it a temper tantrum from the United States in the big scheme of things. Whereas, but yeah, there has been damage done, and there is going to be a higher level of distrust from allies as a result of this.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate your time. Besides your book, which I'll put the link to in the description down below, where else can we follow your work?
Thanks, David. Well, BCA Research would continue to do combination of geopolitics and macro analysis, geo-macro, and that's what we're doing. And of course, we're serving clients in the financial industry, and we're making sure that we focus on the geopolitical changes that are relevant.
Okay, we'll put the link down below. Thank you very much, Matt. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot, David.
Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe. Follow Matt in the links down below. And please use my code LIN, L-I-N, when you sign up to Kalshi. Remember, new users who use my code can get $25 when you trade $25 for the first time. Link down below or scan the QR code here.